Okay, so we are now looking into the concept of complex numbers. This is the topic discussed in section 7.7 of your textbook. So, as a head start, complex number is a new type of number, a new system of number, new kinds of number. So, it's like when we were younger, we were learning how to do like deal with numbers like 1, 2, 3, or 4, and as we grow a little older, we learn with numbers like 1.2, 1.5, and 3.2, 3.5, something like that. And here we start looking at what's so-called complex number. Okay, so it's once again it's a new kind of number that you're learning. So now let's start with the most basic idea here. The most basic idea of complex number is the imaginary number. Okay? This is the most basic idea. So the motivation here all came back from, now just I remember a couple of days ago when I was teaching you all how to do square root of a negative number. Let's say square root of a negative 4, for example, right? And the answer a couple of days ago when we were learning the earlier part of sections of chapter 7, then this was not possible to find an answer, right? It's not possible to find an answer for square root of negative 4. The whole reason here is because we have a negative inside the square root. However, right now, in section 7.7 here, we are starting to learn how to handle the square root of a negative number. Okay, so the idea now is that, first off, square root of a negative 4, the negative number 4 right here, all that trouble really comes from the negative 1 times with a positive 4. Okay, and I hope you all agree with me on this. Once again, all the trouble, that negative 4 right here, all that trouble with the negative, it all came from a negative 1 times 4 as a product. So in other words, I can try to rewrite my minus 4 here underneath the square root as a negative 1 times 4. And so by doing that, what I can do here is that we have learned earlier the property of with square root is that when we have the square root, or just generally any root, then we can always split the root into square root of negative 1 times square root of 4. Okay? And so now, at least up to this point here, square root of 4, we know automatically how to find that, right? Square root of 4 is a 2. That's what it is. So square root of 4 is a 2 with the products. Now, the only problem left here is that we still don't know how to find out the square root of a negative 1. So it's a new definition now. I'm going to call the square root of negative 1 is an I. It is, yes, it is a surprise. It's a new type of number now. So from this day on, whenever you see square root of a negative 1, we define square root of a negative 1 to be an I. Okay? So I is a way to represent square root of negative 1. And so the problem here is that we don't try to look for a real value of I. We're not looking for I. It's not going to be like 1, 2, or 3, or whatsoever. I here is just something imagined. We have to imagine that it's there, but it's not really some number. So once again, the definition here is that y equals the square root of negative 1. All right. So now back to the problem here. So we got I times 2. So that means it's the same as a convention. We put 2i. We put the I in the end. Okay, and so that's how we found, that's what we can handle. That's what we can do with the square root of negative 4. Okay, so my expectation for you, my students, I'm not going to expect you to be able to derive all this work here until the end point. All I expect from you is to be able to see the shortcut here. So let's look at the change here. Here we got square root of negative 4, right? And so the short way of doing this is you can think of when you're taking square root of a negative 4, then you can think of momentarily, for now, we just ignore the minus sign. And then simply think of taking the square root of 4. So that would give you 2. And then because we have a minus there, that put me an I right here. Okay? So let's start looking at some example here. So remember for today, I is defined to be square root of negative 1. Now remember, it's square root of negative 1. Okay? So now, let's look into a couple of examples here. Okay? So, we are trying to find square root of minus 25. Okay? Once again, we are looking at the square root of a negative number. So the way to do that, I am not going to expect you to be able to go through all this. I mean, it's going to be a lot of work for you. Right? And if you want to, sure, that's fine, but I wouldn't expect you to be able to master with that. I wouldn't expect you to master that, but then here's the thing. For square root of a negative number 25 right here, square root of negative 25, to find that, first of all, once again, momentarily ignore that negative sign in front of the 25. And so we got square root of 25 is a 5. Okay? So just think of the positive part. Square root of 25 is 5. Right? And because now the number inside the root is a negative number, I put an I there. So the answer is a 5i. Okay? And you can see in another example that we can have, square root of negative 16, right? So once again, to find the answer to that, the negative in front of the 16 underneath the square root, for now we can ignore that. So momentarily ignore that negative. Think of the square root of 16, which is going to give you 4. So we have 4, and then because the number 16 here is actually a negative 16 underneath the square root, we do 4i. Okay? So now, the bottom line here is we only have to use the imaginary number. The I now, the name for the I, okay? I is called the imaginary number. Imaginary number. Okay? Because it's not some number that we can compute. It's not a value that we can do computation with that, but it's still something's there. Okay? So the imaginary number here, we only need that whenever we have square root of a negative 1. I mean, we have square root of a negative number. So when you're working with the I number here, we're only working with square roots. So you don't have to worry about, because remember, cube root of a negative 27, cube root, you can find the cube root of a negative number just fine, right? The answer here is a minus 3. So for cube root, you don't have to worry about negative number. You don't have to worry about the I, but when you're taking square roots of a negative number, yes, that's where you need the I. Okay? So, in another example, now someone might be concerned, how about, now the examples I've shown so far, these are perfect square somehow, right? 25 and 16, and even with the starting example that we had, even the starting number that we have, square root of a negative 4, the number I have chosen to be perfect square. Okay, but then some of you might be concerned, so what about square root of a negative number which is not a perfect square? So how about square root of negative 8, for example? Okay, so this time you can see 8 is not a perfect square. Right? But the way to compute this square root of negative 8 is similar to the way how we did earlier. So what we did earlier, we momentarily ignore the minus sign. Okay, so for now we ignore the minus sign. So think of doing square root for 8. So it's square root of 8 in I. Okay? And then square root of 8 is the same as 2 square root 2. Right? So now we put the I there. Right? So once again, it's as easy as doing square root of minus 16. All you have to do, ignore the minus sign. Right? And then square root of 8 that we have here, square root of 8 is the same as 2 times square root 2. Now, we have spent a good amount of time learning how to simplify square roots, so I'm not going to go in detail how I got 2 square root 2 right here. It is your responsibility to review your notes and to understand why square root of 8 is a 2 square root 2. Okay? And so the reason I put an I here, because the 8 that we're starting out with the problem, the 8 here was a minus 8. Okay? So, in another example you can see, how about square root of negative 20? Okay? And that would be the same as, once again, for now, ignore the minus sign, right? Momentarily, temporarily, ignore the minus sign, so we have square root of 20. Square root of 20, after reduction, is actually 2 square root 5, okay? And then, to take care of that negative, we put the I here at the end. And that's how I find my final answer to square root of negative 20. And here is the final answer to square root of minus 8. Okay, so what you're learning now is, once again, the I here is called the imaginary number. Okay, the imaginary number. Just the I itself is called the imaginary number. Okay, and then the way how to take square root of a negative number is simple. We just ignore for now, ignore the minus sign, right, momentarily, and then just think of taking simply the square root of the positive number, and then in the end put the I to that. Okay, so we have had about like four examples with the how to compute the imaginary number, how to get an imaginary number.